The wagon wheels had not even finished creaking to a stop before Violet Wilcox climbed down, boots hitting the dust of Cottonwood Creek Ranch with a purpose that made Daniel Boone set down his branding iron and straighten to his full height. "You are standing on my father's land, Mr. Boone," she said, before he had managed a single word of greeting, "and I would be obliged if you moved your fence posts off it by the end of the month." Daniel wiped his blackened hands on a rag hanging from his belt and studied her the way he might study a storm cloud building over the Bradshaw Mountains, trying to judge how much trouble it planned to bring him. She was younger than he expected a schoolteacher to be, maybe 25 or 26, with dark hair pinned up under a traveling bonnet that had clearly seen better roads than the one leading out from Prescott, and eyes the color of good rye whiskey held up to firelight, steady and unblinking on his face. "Ma'am, I do not know who told you this was your father's land, but I bought this ranch 3 years ago from a man named Jasper Kell, fair and square, with a deed recorded at the land office in Prescott. I have raised cattle on it, dug 2 wells, and built that house with my own 2 hands." He nodded toward the low adobe structure behind him, its roofline still smelling faintly of fresh mortar from a repair he had finished only that spring. "I am sorry for whatever confusion sent you all this way, but there has been no mistake here." "There has been a considerable mistake, Mr. Boone, and it was not mine." She reached into a leather satchel and produced a folded paper, creased soft as cloth from handling, and held it out to him as though it were a loaded pistol, and she intended to let it do her talking. "This is a homestead patent granted to Thomas Wilcox in the year 1879 for 160 acres along Cottonwood Creek, signed by the Territorial Land Registrar and recorded in the Prescott office under file number 412. Thomas Wilcox was my father. He died 2 years ago, and this land passed to me as his only living heir. I have the original patent in my hand, and I intend to see it honored." Daniel did not reach for the paper. He was aware, the way a man is aware of a rattlesnake before he sees it, that whatever was written on that page might be true, and that if it was true, 3 years of his life were about to come apart at the seams. He had learned to read well enough to make out a bill of sale or a cattle brand registry, slow and careful, sounding out the harder words under his breath when no one was near enough to hear him stumble. But a legal patent with its formal language and its stamped seals was another matter entirely, and he did not want this woman watching his lips move over words he could not quite catch. "I will look at it," he said, "when we are both in front of somebody who can tell us plainly what it says and what it does not say. Prescott is a day's ride from here. We can leave in the morning." "We can leave within the hour," Violet said. "I did not travel 2,000 miles from Ohio to wait on your convenience, Mr. Boone. And I am not fixing to hand a stranger my home on her say-so alone, ma'am, however far she has traveled." He looked past her at the wagon, at the trunk lashed behind the seat, at the hired driver from the stage line already climbing down to stretch his legs. "But I will not leave a lady standing in my yard arguing with the sun going down, either. There is a spare room in that house that has never once been slept in. You will take supper with me, and we will ride for Prescott come first light." She looked as though she wanted to refuse purely on principle, and for a moment Daniel thought she might climb back into the wagon and demand the driver take her straight to town rather than spend a single night under his roof. But something in her seemed to weigh the practical truth of it, the coming dark, the long empty miles behind her, and she nodded once, sharp and businesslike, the way he imagined she might nod at a schoolroom full of restless children before informing them exactly how the day was going to go. "Supper," she agreed. And then Prescott. He did not sleep well that night, listening to the unfamiliar sound of another person moving in the room down the hall, and when he rose before dawn to saddle the horses, he found her already awake at the kitchen table, going through a small stack of papers by lamplight with the quiet, methodical concentration of someone building a fortress out of ink and paper. He did not ask what she was reading. He suspected he already knew. The ride to Prescott took most of the day, the road climbing steadily out of the low desert scrub into pinon and juniper country, and it was somewhere past the halfway point, with the sun sitting low and orange and strange behind a haze that had not been there the day before, that Violet finally broke the long silence between them. "You have not asked me a single question about my father," she said. "Most men in your position would want to know who he was, how he died, why I waited 2 years to come claim what was his." "I figured you would tell me if you wanted me to know," Daniel said. "Man learns, driving wagon trains as long as I did, that folks tell you their grief on their own schedule, not yours." That earned him a sideways glance, sharper with curiosity than suspicion now. "You drove wagon trains. 15 years of it. Santa Fe Trail, then the Gila route, guiding families out from Missouri and Kansas clear to California and back again, when some of them lost their nerve for it. Buried 3 good men along the way and 1 good horse I still miss more than I ought to admit. Decided 4 years back that my bones had earned a place to stop moving, and Cottonwood Creek looked like as good a place as any." "That explains the way you sit a horse," she said. "Like it costs you nothing. Most ranchers I have met since arriving in this territory sit like they are afraid of falling off, though I suppose I have only met 2 of them so far, and you were the friendlier one, which is a low bar to clear. I will take the compliment where I can get it." He allowed himself the ghost of a smile. "Boone, any relation to the famous one folks always want to know. Are you?" "Distant cousin," my grandmother always claimed, though she also claimed to have danced with Andrew Jackson once, so I have learned to take her stories with a grain of salt the size of a fist. That drew an actual laugh out of her, short and surprised, as though she had not expected to find anything to laugh about on this particular ride. "What about you, Miss Wilcox? What brought a schoolteacher from Ohio all the way to a territory that most folks back east still think is nothing but cactus and outlaws?" Her smile faded, not into anger this time but into something quieter and older. "My father wrote to me for 3 years about this land. About the creek that ran clear even in August when every other water source for 20 miles turned to mud. About the children of the miners and the ranch families who had no school within 30 miles of them. About how he meant to set aside a piece of this ground someday for a proper schoolhouse, so that no child in this valley would grow up unable to read a letter from home or a bill from the company store. I trained as a teacher in Columbus so that, when the time came, I would be ready. Then I got a letter saying he had died alone out checking his fence lines during a summer heat wave, and by the time I had settled his affairs and saved enough for my passage west, someone else was living on his land." Daniel said nothing for a long moment, the horse's hooves the only sound on the dry road. "I am sorry," he said finally, and meant it, "for your father and for whatever part I have played in complicating what he wanted for you." "You did not know," she said. "I am not fool enough to blame a man for another man's dishonesty. You think somebody was dishonest. I think a homestead patent does not simply vanish from a land office, Mr. Boone, and I think it is a strange thing indeed that a man named Jasper Kell was able to sell you 160 acres that my father had legally patented 6 years earlier." She looked at him then, steady and direct. "I do not think it was you, but I mean to find out who it was." They were still turning that thought over between them, the road bending north toward the last long stretch before Prescott, when Daniel first caught the smell. He had spent enough years on the trail to know wood smoke from grass smoke, and grass smoke from the thick, resinous stink of pinon and juniper burning hot and fast, and what reached his nose now on a shift of hot wind was all 3 at once, close and getting closer. He reined in his horse and stood in the stirrups, scanning the ridge to the west, and saw it then. A brown-gray smear climbing into the sky where there should have been nothing but clear late summer blue, and beneath it, unmistakable even at this distance, a thin orange line eating along the ridge top. "Wildfire," he said, "coming down off the Bradshaws and coming fast on this wind." Violet followed his gaze, and to her credit she did not scream or freeze the way he had seen some Eastern travelers do at their first sight of open flame on open land. "The stage station," she said instead. "I passed through it yesterday on my way out to your ranch, Willow Springs. There is a family there, the Hendersons, and an old man who tends the relay horses. Is it in the path of that?" Daniel was already turning his horse. "It might be. Wind changes fast up in that country, bounces off the canyon walls unpredictable as a drunk mule. We are not far off the turn for it. Can you ride hard, Miss Wilcox, or do you need me to lead your horse?" "I grew up on a farm in Ohio before I ever set foot in a schoolroom, Mr. Boone. I can ride hard." And she proved it, kicking her borrowed mare into a gallop that had him working to keep pace, her bonnet coming loose and streaming behind her like a signal flag as they cut off the main road onto the rough track that led down toward the stage station. They came over the last rise to find the little settlement already in chaos, gray ash beginning to sift down out of the sky like a filthy snow, the wind carrying embers that landed hissing in the dry grass around the corrals. A woman was screaming for her children near the barn, and an old man was struggling alone to lead 6 panicked relay horses out of a burning corral, the animals rearing and fighting him at every step. "The horses!" Daniel shouted, already swinging down before his own mount had fully stopped. "Get the family clear first. I will take the stock." Violet did not argue or ask what she should do instead. She went straight for the screaming woman, catching her by the shoulders and speaking to her in a low, firm voice that cut through the panic better than shouting could have. Daniel, hauling open the corral gate with his bare hands despite the heat radiating off the singed wood, heard fragments of it as he worked. "Where are your children? Look at me. Where were they last? The well house, are you certain? Then we go to the well house, not the road. The road is not safe with this wind." She had the woman moving within seconds, and by the time Daniel had wrestled the last of the terrified horses out through the gate and slapped it hard on the rump to send it running clear, he saw Violet emerging from behind the well house with 2 small children in tow, one on each hand, walking them calmly away from the fire line even as sparks danced in the grass not 30 feet behind them. "There is a wash a quarter-mile east," Daniel called to her, coughing now as the smoke thickened. "Cuts down through bare rock, nothing to burn. Get everyone there and stay low. This wind will turn again before long. It always does in these canyons. And you. I'm going to cut a fire break along that fence line before this whole station goes up. Go, Violet, I will catch up." It was the first time he had used her given name, and neither of them seemed to notice it in the moment, both too occupied with the roaring, crackling danger bearing down on them. But later, much later, Violet would remember that it had happened here, in the smoke and the screaming horses, and not in any quiet parlor conversation. She got the family to the wash. Daniel, working alone with a shovel and a wet feed sack, tore a break through the dry grass wide enough that, when the fire reached it 20 minutes later, it guttered and stumbled and, driven by a wind that did indeed shift just as he had promised, curled back on itself and began to die rather than leap the gap. By the time the old stage tender found his voice enough to thank anyone, the immediate danger had passed, though smoke hung thick over the valley for the rest of that day and long into the night, turning the sunset an eerie, bruised red that made Violet think of blood in water. They reached Prescott a full day later than planned, both of them smelling of smoke, Violet's traveling dress scorched along one hem, but alive, and the Hendersons and the old stage tender and all 6 relay horses alive along with them. "You did well back there," Daniel told her as they walked their tired horses up the main street of Prescott, past the Territorial Capitol building and the rows of false-fronted stores. "Better than most grown men I have seen face down a grass fire for the first time. My father used to say fear is only useful if you let it tell you what to do instead of what to feel," Violet said. "I have found that advice serves rather better than most of what they taught me in normal school. Your father sounds like he was a wise man." He was a stubborn man who happened to be right most of the time, which people often mistake for wisdom. But she smiled when she said it, and Daniel found himself thinking that he would like to hear more about Thomas Wilcox, stubborn or otherwise, before this business between them was finished. The Prescott Land office occupied a narrow brick building 2 doors down from the assay office, and the clerk who greeted them, a thin, nervous young man named Prout with ink-stained fingers and a habit of glancing at the door every few seconds, grew visibly paler when Violet laid her father's patent on the counter beside it. "This is highly irregular," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "The Kell transaction was recorded properly, I assure you, filed and stamped in this very office. Filed 3 weeks after my father's death," Violet said. "I would like to see the original entry in the land book, Mr. Prout, not simply hear you assure me of its propriety." The clerk hesitated long enough that Daniel, standing quietly at Violet's shoulder, began to understand that hesitation itself was an answer. When Prout finally produced the heavy ledger and laid it open on the counter, Violet ran her finger down the column of dates and entries with the same careful, unhurried attention she must once have given to grading a child's arithmetic, and stopped. "This entry has been altered," she said. "Look here, Mr. Boone. The ink on the date is a different shade than the ink used for the description just above it, and the numeral has been written over something else entirely. Someone changed the recording date after the fact." Daniel leaned in and looked, and though the finer points of ink shading were beyond his notice, he could see plainly enough that the 7 in the year had a strange doubled edge to it, as though a different hand had gone back later and thickened the line. "Who else has had access to this ledger since it was filed, Mr. Prout?" The clerk's throat worked visibly. "I would rather not say, Mr. Boone. I have a family in this town." "Are you afraid of someone, Mr. Prout?" Violet asked, her voice gentler now, the voice of a woman who had learned to coax reluctant truths out of frightened children. "Because if someone falsified a land record to steal my father's homestead after his death, that is a federal matter, and I intend to see it corrected whether you help me or not. It would go easier for you if you helped me." Prout looked at the door again, then at both of them, and lowered his voice to barely above a whisper. "Elias Cobb," he said. "He owns the ironwood mine out past Willow Springs. Jasper Kell worked for him, some kind of business associate. I never rightly knew the arrangement. Cobb came in here himself not 2 months after your father passed, Miss Wilcox, asking after the Wilcox patent, asking what would happen to unclaimed land if no heir came forward to file. When I told him the law required a waiting period and public notice, he seemed satisfied enough. Then a few weeks later the Kell filing appeared in the book, and I was told, very plainly, that it would be healthier for me not to ask questions about it." Daniel felt something cold settle in his stomach, the particular chill of a man realizing he has been used as a piece on somebody else's chessboard, without ever being told the game was being played. "Kell told me he'd bought the land fair from the previous owner's estate, no living heirs, all legal and proper. I paid him $1,100 in gold coin for this ranch, Mr. Prout. Where do I find this Jasper Kell now?" "Gone," Prout said. "Left the territory not long after your purchase closed, Mr. Boone. Nobody has seen him in better than 2 years." Violet's eyes met Daniel's across the counter, and he saw in them not triumph at having proven her claim, but a grim, weary understanding that matched his own. Whatever fraud had been worked here, it had used them both, and the man behind it was still very much present in this territory, still very much a power to be reckoned with, and now very much aware, thanks to Prout's visible fright, that his careful scheme was beginning to unravel. "We are not finished with this conversation, Mr. Prout," Violet said, gathering up her father's patent with careful hands. "But I believe we have learned enough for today." They rode back toward Cottonwood Creek Ranch in a silence that had changed character entirely from the wary quiet of the outbound journey. This was not suspicion between them now, but something closer to shared purpose. 2 people who had discovered they were standing on the same side of a line neither of them had drawn. "I ought to be angrier at you," Daniel said eventually, "for showing up and telling me my home was never mine. But mostly what I feel is angry at a man I have never met for making fools of us both. You are taking this remarkably well, Mr. Boone. 15 years driving wagon trains teaches a man that anger spent on what cannot be changed is anger wasted. What can be changed is whether Elias Cobb gets away with whatever he is building toward. I would guess this is not only about 160 acres and a dead man's homestead." "No," Violet agreed. "I would guess it is about the creek. A stamp mill needs water, Mr. Boone, and a great deal of it. And Cottonwood Creek is the only reliable water source for 10 miles in any direction that is not already claimed by someone else with deep pockets and deeper lawyers." They reached the ranch as the light was failing, smoke still hazing the western sky, though the immediate fire danger near Willow Springs had passed, and it was there, in the deepening dusk, that the second fire found them. Whether it began from a stray ember carried on the wind from the earlier blaze, or from something else entirely, Daniel would spend a long time afterward wondering, but the dry grass along his northern fence line was already burning by the time they rode into the yard, flames low and creeping but spreading fast in the wind, and his cattle, penned in the near pasture, were bawling and pressing against the fence rails in a panic that threatened to bring the whole structure down. "The gate latch is jammed," Daniel shouted, already off his horse and running for the pasture fence. "Get the wagon horses clear of the barn. I will open this pen before they trample each other." He reached the gate and found the iron latch had warped and stuck fast, likely from the heat already radiating off the nearby grass fire, and rather than waste precious seconds hunting for a tool, he drew his belt knife and began sawing at the leather strap holding the gate closed, working fast with the cattle pressing and shoving against the rails behind him. The knife slipped as a heavy shoulder slammed into the gate from the far side, and the blade opened a deep gash across the palm and fingers of his right hand before skittering into the dirt. He did not stop to look at it. He wrenched the gate open with his good hand and his shoulder, driving the cattle out into the safety of the open corral beyond, and only when the last steer had cleared the gate and the immediate danger had passed did he look down and see the blood soaking dark through his shirt cuff and dripping steadily off his fingers. Violet was there almost before he had finished registering the pain, having already turned the wagon team loose into the horse corral and come running at the sight of him, standing swaying slightly by the broken gate. "Let me see that," she said, and there was no question in her voice now, only the same brisk authority she had used on the frightened mother back at Willow Springs. She took his wrist in both hands, turning his palm up toward what little light remained, and her mouth tightened at what she saw. "This needs cleaning and binding properly, Mr. Boone, and it needs it now, not after you finish making certain every last cow is accounted for. Inside, now." He might have argued with anyone else. He found, to his own mild surprise, that he did not want to argue with her. Inside the ranch house, by lamplight, she worked with a competence that told him this was not the first wound she had ever tended. She had him sit at the kitchen table while she fetched water still warm from the stove reservoir, tore clean strips from a linen pillowcase she found in the spare room, and set about washing the gash with a gentleness that did not disguise her thoroughness. "You did not scream," she observed, working carefully along the edge of the cut. "Most men I have known would have made considerably more noise over an injury like this." 15 years on the trail, a man learns which kinds of hurt are worth hollering over and which are just going to have to be borne, Daniel said through gritted teeth, because in truth it hurt like the devil and he was exercising every ounce of composure he owned to keep from showing it. "This is not the worst hand injury I have had. A mule stepped clean on my foot once outside Santa Fe, and I did not walk right for a month." How reassuring, but there was warmth under the dryness of her tone. "This cut is deep, and it runs across your palm in a place that will make it difficult to close your hand properly while it heals. You will need to keep it clean, keep it wrapped, and you will need to keep from using this hand for anything heavier than lifting a coffee cup for at least a week, perhaps 2. I have a ranch to run, Miss Wilcox. Cattle do not care whether my hand is wrapped. Then you had better hope you have a schoolteacher handy who is willing to stay a few days and help you manage, because an infected hand on a man alone out here could cost you considerably more than a week of cattle work. She said it plainly, without coyness, as though the solution were simply the most practical one available, and not, as they both understood without saying so, an arrangement that would place them under one roof for days to come, at a moment when the ground between them had already shifted from adversaries to something neither of them had a ready name for yet. Daniel studied her by lamplight, this woman who had arrived in his yard barely 2 days ago to inform him she was taking away everything he owned, and who now sat bent over his injured hand with more care than he had received from most people in years. "I would be obliged, Violet," he said quietly, "if you would stay." She looked up at him, and something passed between them in that look that had nothing to do with deeds or land offices or dead men's homesteads. "Then I will stay," she said, "until your hand is fit to work again. But I intend to make use of the time, Mr. Boone. I did not come to this territory only to fight over property lines. I came to teach, and I do not see why that has to wait on lawyers." The days that followed settled into a rhythm neither of them had expected to find comfortable. Violet rose early to help with what chores could be managed one-handed, learning quickly which tasks Daniel could still do himself, and which required her hands as well as her patience. In the slower hours of midday, with his right hand bound and useless in a sling she had fashioned from a scrap of canvas, she brought out her small store of books and slates, ostensibly to prepare her lessons for whatever children might someday fill a schoolhouse that did not yet exist, and it was on the third such afternoon that she caught him watching the pages over her shoulder with an expression she recognized. Having seen it many times before on the faces of children in her Ohio classroom who were ashamed to admit they could not follow along. "You do not read easily," she said, not as an accusation but as a simple observation, the kind she might have made about a horse favoring one leg. Daniel's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might deny it or make some excuse and leave the room. Instead, he let out a long breath and set down the coffee cup he had been holding awkwardly in his left hand. "I can make out most of what I need to," he said. "Brand's bills, a letter if it is written plain and slow. My mother taught me my letters before she passed, when I was 7, and then there was no more schooling to be had, not with 3 younger sisters and a father who needed hands for the farm and then for the wagon trail. I learned enough to get by. I never learned enough to feel easy with a book in my hands. That is nothing to be ashamed of, Daniel." It was the first time she had used his given name as freely as he had once used hers, and he noticed it the way a man notices the first cool evening after a long hot summer. A great many capable men and women in this territory never had the chance at schooling that I did. It is not a measure of your worth. It is only a measure of what doors were open to you and what doors were not. Easy enough for a schoolteacher to say. Easy enough for a schoolteacher to know, because I have spent 3 years watching bright children convinced they are stupid simply because no one ever sat down and showed them patiently enough. She turned her chair slightly to face him more fully. "I have some time on my hands, Mr. Boone, since you are so inconveniently determined to keep your ranch running with only one good hand at your disposal. Would you object terribly if your schoolteacher gave you a lesson or 2, while we wait for that hand of yours to heal?" He should have said no. Some old, proud part of him wanted to say no, wanted to protect the careful armor he had built around this particular soft place in himself for nearly 30 years. But she was looking at him with none of the pity he had always feared such an offer would carry, only the same calm, ready patience she had shown the terrified children at Willow Springs, and he found himself nodding before he had entirely decided to. "All right," he said, "but if I make a fool of myself, you are sworn to secrecy, same as if I had told you a trail secret." "Cross my heart," Violet said, and for the first time since she had climbed down from that wagon and upended his entire life, she smiled at him with nothing held back. They began that afternoon with his own name, which he could already write in a stiff, careful hand, and moved from there to the cattle tally book, sounding out the words for brands and weights and buyers until the shapes on the page began to loosen their grip on him and become simply words, plain and unthreatening. Violet was patient in a way he had not expected from someone who moved through the rest of her life with such brisk efficiency, never rushing him, never letting her voice slip into the tone of correction that he remembered, faintly and painfully, from the 1 year of formal schooling he had managed as a boy. "You have a good ear," she told him, on the 4th evening, as he worked his way slowly through a passage in her worn copy of McGuffey's Reader that she had brought west for exactly this purpose, though she had imagined using it on children rather than on a rancher twice as tall as any pupil she had ever taught. "You hear the shape of a sentence before you can read it. That is rarer than you think. I have spent a great many years listening to men read trail maps and manifests out loud around the campfire," Daniel admitted. "Maybe some of it stuck without my meaning it too. Maybe you are simply more capable than you have ever let yourself believe." She said it lightly, but he heard the truth underneath it, and something in his chest loosened that had been clenched tight since he was 7 years old, and his mother's coffin had been lowered into Missouri clay, taking with it the last patient teacher he had known. It was during these long, lamplit evenings, his bandaged hand resting on the table between them, her voice low and warm as she guided him through sentences that grew steadily less frightening, that Daniel understood he was falling in love with her, not despite the fact that she had arrived to take his ranch away, but in some strange sense because of it, because she was the first person in longer than he cared to admit who had looked past what he could not do and found something worth teaching in what remained. "You have not asked me yet what I plan to do about the ranch," Violet said one evening, closing the reader and studying him across the lamp's small circle of light. "I figured you would tell me when you were ready. My father wanted this land to belong to the whole valley, in a manner of speaking, a school for the miners' children who cannot afford to send them 30 miles to Prescott, a well the ranch families could rely on in dry years, a piece of ground that was not owned by any mining company and beholden to no one's debts. I do not think he would want me to simply take it back and put you out, Daniel, not after what you have built here, and not when it was never truly your fault that fraud was worked against us both. What do you think he would want?" "I think," Violet said slowly, "that he would want us to find a way to make it belong to both of us, in whatever fashion makes sense once this business with Elias Cobb is finished. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Cobb did not go to the trouble of falsifying a land record for nothing, and I do not believe for one moment that he intends to simply let the truth come out without a fight." She was, as it happened, entirely correct. Elias Cobb came to Cottonwood Creek Ranch himself 4 days later, riding in with 2 hired men trailing behind him, and an expression of oiled, unhurried confidence that told Daniel this was a man accustomed to getting whatever he wanted from whomever stood in his path. He was perhaps 50, silver at the temples, dressed in a suit too fine for ranch country, and he sat his horse with the stiff discomfort of a man who had made his fortune in mining rather than in the saddle. "Mr. Boone," Cobb said, not bothering to dismount, "and Miss Wilcox, I presume. Word travels fast in a small territory. I understand there has been some confusion regarding the title to this property." "No confusion at all, Mr. Cobb," Violet said, standing on the porch with her arms folded, her chin lifted in a way that Daniel was already coming to recognize as her particular brand of fearlessness. "My father's homestead pat predates the Kell filing by 6 years. The Prescott Land Office has already confirmed the entry was altered after the fact. I imagine you know a great deal about that alteration." If Cobb was rattled by her directness, he did not show it. Serious accusations for a schoolteacher fresh off the stage from Ohio. "I came here as a neighbor, hoping to spare everyone considerable unpleasantness." The ironwood mine has need of this creek for its milling operations, and I am prepared to pay handsomely for the water rights, whoever ultimately holds the deed. $10,000, Mr. Boone, Miss Wilcox, split however you two see fit to arrange it between yourselves. That is more money than either of you will see in a decade otherwise. And if we refuse? Daniel asked, keeping his bandaged hand out of sight behind him, some instinct telling him not to show this man any weakness at all. Then I suppose the courts will have to sort out a very complicated and very expensive dispute, and men in this territory who cross me in matters of business have a way of finding their lives considerably more difficult afterward. Cobb smiled, thin and cold. I would hate to see that happen to two such industrious young people. Think on my offer. I will not make it twice. He wheeled his horse and rode off with his two hired men, leaving behind a silence that felt to Daniel very much like the stillness before a storm breaks. He as good as confessed, Violet said quietly, watching them go, warning us and threatening us in the same breath. He also just told us he is afraid, Daniel said. A man secure in his position does not ride out personally to make an offer he could have sent a lawyer to deliver. He is worried about what we know and worried about what we might do with it. Then we had better decide quickly what we intend to do with it. What they decided over the following days was that Violet would go to Prescott and to Willow Springs to gather allies, while Daniel, his hand healing steadily under her continued care though still too tender for heavy rope work, would ride the boundaries of the ranch and the surrounding grazing land to watch for any further move Cobb's men might make, and to warn the scattered ranch families in the valley of what was coming. Violet proved a formidable recruiter. She called first on the Hendersons at Willow Springs, who owed her a debt of gratitude from the fire, and gave it gladly in the form of their support and their willingness to spread word among the other stage stations along the route. She called on Dr. Aaron Finch in Prescott, an aging physician who had treated more than one miner brought down from the ironwood works with injuries the company blamed on carelessness, rather than on the rotted timber shoring that Cobb refused to replace in his deeper shafts, and who was more than willing to speak plainly, if quietly, about what he had seen. She called on the editor of the Prescott Weekly Courier, a sharp-eyed woman named Sarah Talbot, who had been trying for a year to get anyone to speak on the record about conditions at the mine, and who nearly wept with relief at finding a witness willing to help her build a case in print. And she called, most dangerously of all, on 3 miners' wives in the company town outside Ironwood itself, women who told her in hushed voices about husbands trapped in debt to the company store, paid in scrip that could only be spent at Cobb's own prices, unable to leave because they owed more than they could ever earn, and about 2 men who had died in a shaft collapsed the previous winter that Cobb had reported to the Territorial Mining Office as a simple accident. Though every miner in the camp knew the support timbers had been condemned as unsafe weeks before. He is trapping them, Violet told Daniel that evening, back at the ranch, her voice tight with the particular anger of someone who has just confirmed a suspicion she desperately wished had proven false. Keeping them illiterate on purpose, some of them, so they cannot read their own contracts closely enough to see how badly they are being cheated, cannot write letters home asking for help, cannot even read the safety notices posted at the mine entrance that would tell them which shafts to avoid. It is the same reason he wants this land, Daniel. It is not only the water. It is that a school here, a real school, would eventually teach every child in that camp to read well enough to see through exactly what he is doing to their families. Daniel sat with that for a long moment, turning his bandaged hand over slowly in the lamplight, remembering his own shame at a McGuffey's reader only days before, and thinking of it now not as a small private embarrassment, but as a wound Cobb had learned to inflict deliberately on entire families for the sake of his own profit. "Then we had better make certain that school gets built," he said, "whatever it costs us." It cost them very nearly everything. The midpoint of their reckoning came when Sarah Talbot's inquiries turned up a name, neither of them had expected. A prospector who claimed to have shared a bunkhouse with Jasper Kell in Tucson, some 18 months back, and who swore Kell had told him, deep in his cups, that Cobb had paid him $2,000 to put his name on a false land filing, and then to disappear from the territory entirely, on the promise that if he ever returned or spoke of it, Cobb's men would see he did not live to spend the money. Kell, by this account, had taken a stage to California and had not been heard from since. It was not quite proof enough to hang a case on in a territorial court, not without Kell himself to testify, but it was enough, combined with the altered land office ledger and Pruitt's frightened testimony, to convince even the most cautious of allies that Cobb's fraud ran deeper than a single falsified record. It was also, unfortunately, enough to convince Elias Cobb that his careful scheme was unraveling faster than he could contain it, and men who feel the ground shifting beneath them, Daniel had learned long ago on the trail, often become considerably more dangerous rather than less. Cobb's second visit came alone, and at night, and it was not to the ranch but to the small room above the Prescott dry goods store where Violet had been staying while she gathered her allies. He did not threaten her directly. He was too careful for that, with Sarah Talbot's newspaper office only 2 doors down and half the town by now aware that something was brewing between the schoolteacher and the mine owner. Instead, he made her an offer of a different kind entirely. "Leave the territory, Miss Wilcox," he said, standing in her doorway with his hat in his hands, his voice pitched low and almost gentle, the voice of a reasonable man delivering an unpleasant truth for her own good. "Sign the deed over to me, take the $10,000 and go home to Ohio, and I give you my word that no harm will come to Mr. Boone. He can keep the house, keep his cattle, live out his days undisturbed on land I will lease back to him for a token rent. But if you insist on this fight, Miss Wilcox, I cannot promise what happens to a man who stands so determinedly in my way. Accidents happen in fire season. Fences fail. Cattle stampede. I would hate for something to happen to your rancher on account of your stubbornness." He left before she could answer him, confident, she understood with a chill, that the threat alone would do its work. It very nearly did. Violet sat awake long into that night, turning the choice over and over, and by the gray hour before dawn she had convinced herself of a terrible, selfless logic, that her father's dream of a school could wait, that some other year, some other teacher, some other set of circumstances might see it built without costing Daniel Boone his life, but that she could not live with herself if her refusal to bend got him killed. She began quietly to pack. She did not get far. Daniel had ridden into Prescott before first light, restless with a feeling he could not name, some old trail instinct that had kept him and his wagon parties alive through 15 years of dangerous country, and he found her in the gray pre-dawn light of the boardwalk outside the dry goods store, a single trunk beside her, waiting for the earliest stage east. "Going somewhere?" he asked, though his voice was not light at all. She would not meet his eyes at first. "Cobb came to me last night. He offered to leave you unharmed if I signed the deed to him and leave the territory. I have decided to accept." "You have decided," Daniel repeated, and something in his chest went cold and then, immediately after, hot with an anger he rarely let himself feel. "Without asking me, without so much as a word. There was nothing to discuss, Daniel. I will not be the reason you die out here. And I am supposed to simply let you throw away your father's whole dream, everything you crossed a continent to build, because a coward threatened me with an accident he has not the courage to arrange himself in broad daylight." He crossed the boardwalk and took the trunk from her hands, setting it down hard enough that she finally looked up at him. "Violet, I have buried men on the trail who died because somebody made a choice alone, trying to spare the rest of us pain, instead of trusting us enough to face the danger together. I will not let you make that choice for me, not for my sake, and not for your father's memory either. He wanted this school built for every child in that mining camp who cannot read a fair contract from a fraud. You mean to hand that dream to the very man who is cheating them." "I mean to keep you alive," she said, and her voice broke at last, the composed schoolteacher cracking open to show the frightened, fierce woman underneath. I have watched people I love die before, Daniel, my mother, and then my father, and I cannot watch it happen again because I was too stubborn to bend when bending was asked of me. Then do not bend, he said, gentler now, closing the distance between them until there was almost none left at all. Fight, Violet. With me, not instead of me, and not in secret behind my back at 4 in the morning with a trunk packed for Ohio. I did not spend 15 years keeping wagon trains alive across half a continent by running from every man who threatened me with a gun and a grudge. I do not intend to start now, and I certainly do not intend to let the woman I love throw away everything her father worked for to buy me a few more years of a life I would not much want to live without her in it anyway. The words hung between them in the gray light, and Violet realized with a small, startled breath that he had said it plainly, the thing she had been feeling grow in her own chest for days without daring to name it. "You love me," she said, not quite a question. "I have loved you since you stood in my yard with a deed in your hand, telling me my whole life was a mistake, and somehow made me feel like the mistake was worth correcting." He reached up, brushing a strand of hair back from her face with his still healing hand, careful and deliberate. "I do not know how else to say it plainer than that, Violet Wilcox. I love you, and I am not letting you sacrifice your father's dream or yourself to save me from a danger I would rather face with you at my side than survive alone without you." She kissed him then on that quiet Prescott boardwalk in the gray light before dawn, and whatever fear had driven her toward that eastbound stage dissolved into something steadier and far more determined. "All right," she said, when they finally broke apart. "Together, then. But Daniel, if Cobb has decided threats are not enough, we cannot simply wait for him to make his next move. We have to be ready for it." They were ready 3 nights later, though not nearly as ready as either of them would have liked. It began with the smell of smoke, which by now had become so constant a companion of that late summer that at first Daniel dismissed it as merely another distant range fire drifting down from the Bradshaws. But this smoke was closer, and it carried beneath it a sound that no wildfire made: the low murmur of men's voices, and the creak of leather, and the metallic click of a rifle being readied in the dark. "Riders," he said, coming awake all at once in the chair by the fire where he had fallen asleep keeping watch while Violet slept in the spare room. "Violet, wake up. We have company." She was awake and dressed within a minute, her hair still loose around her shoulders, moving with the calm efficiency he had come to rely on in a crisis. Through the front window, in the light of a rising moon hazed orange by smoke, they could count 6 mounted men fanning out around the ranch house, torches in some hands, rifles in others, and at their center, unmistakable even at this distance, the stiff, uncomfortable seat of a man more accustomed to a desk than a saddle. Elias Cobb himself, come to finish what his threats had failed to accomplish. 6 of them, Daniel murmured, watching from the shadow of the window frame. "Us, and old Sam Hendricks who came out to help mind the cattle, and that is the whole of our number tonight." "Then we do not fight them the way they expect to be fought," Violet said. "You said it yourself, Daniel. 15 years keeping wagon trains alive is not won by simply standing and trading shots with whoever outnumbers you. What did you do on the trail when raiders came against a party too small to win a straight fight?" Daniel looked at her for a long moment, something like admiration breaking through the tension in his face. "We made them believe they were outnumbered instead. Come on. We have maybe 10 minutes before they work up the courage to rush the house." What followed was not, in the end, a battle in the way Cobb's hired men had come prepared for one. Daniel sent Sam Hendricks, moving low along the fence line in the smoke-hazed dark, to light 3 separate small fires in barrels positioned around the outer edge of the yard, each one catching quickly and throwing wavering shadows that, combined with careful movement between them, gave the impression of far more than 3 defenders taking up scattered positions. Violet, meanwhile, had remembered the old signal horn Daniel kept for calling in stray cattle, and used it in 3 long blasts, the prearranged signal she and Daniel had agreed upon days earlier with the Hendersons at Willow Springs, and with 2 ranch families further down the valley who had pledged, in return for Violet's tireless recruiting, to come running at the sound of real trouble. Cobb's men, hearing the horn and seeing shadows moving between multiple fires and hearing dogs beginning to bark from what seemed like several directions at once, hesitated in the way that men paid to intimidate rather than to die always eventually hesitate when the cost of pressing forward begins to look higher than they had bargained for. Cobb. Daniel called out from the darkness beside the house, his voice pitched to Carrie. You have got maybe a dozen armed men converging on this ranch inside the next 10 minutes, called in by that horn, same as your own men would answer a mine whistle. You can ride out now, or you can explain to a territorial marshal come morning why 6 armed riders were found trespassing with torches on land you have no legal claim to, land that half of Prescott already knows you stole through fraud. Sarah Talbot's newspaper has the whole story set in type already, waiting on tomorrow's edition. Burning us out tonight only proves every word of it true. There was a long, tense silence, broken only by the crackle of the barrel fires and the distant, entirely real sound of the Hendersons' wagon rattling up the valley road, drawn by the horn signal just as promised, along with 2 more riders from the neighboring ranches, their lanterns bobbing in the smoky dark like a line of fireflies that, to nervous eyes already primed to see an army, looked like a great deal more than 3 additional men. It was one of Cobb's own hired men who broke first, a wiry foreman named Pike who had clearly signed on for wages, and not for a hanging offense, wheeling his horse and calling out that he had not been paid enough to burn down a ranch in front of half the valley's witnesses. His defection cracked the resolve of the others, and within minutes the raiding party was in open disarray, 2 more riders following Pike's lead while Cobb, alone now but for a single loyal man, shouted furiously after them to stand and finish what they had come to do. It was Violet, stepping out onto the porch in full view despite Daniel's sharp, urgent whisper for her to stay back, who delivered the final blow. "Mr. Cobb," she called out, her voice ringing clear across the yard, "Dr. Finch has given a sworn statement to the territorial mining inspector regarding the condition of your ironwood shafts. Sarah Talbot's paper runs tomorrow with an account of the Wilcox land fraud, complete with the altered ledger from the Prescott office, and a statement from a man who heard Jasper Kell confess to taking your money. Riding down here tonight with torches only confirms everything we intend to publish. You may as well turn around now and save yourself the added charge of arson." Cobb sat his horse for a long, furious moment, the fire's orange light throwing his face into harsh relief, and Daniel, rifle steady in his good hand though he had not fired a single shot all night, watched the man calculate his dwindling options the way he had once watched cornered animals calculate theirs. "This is not finished, Miss Wilcox," Cobb said at last, his voice tight with a rage he could no longer quite disguise as reasonableness. "I believe it very nearly is," Violet said. He rode out with his one remaining man, leaving Pike and the 2 other defectors standing sheepishly in Daniel's yard, more than willing, in the relief of the moment, to give full statements about what Cobb had promised them, what he had ordered them to do, and what they had personally witnessed regarding the mine's hidden dangers and the debts he used to trap his workers. No shots had been fired. No one had been killed, though Daniel's heart did not stop pounding until well after the last of the ranch families had gone home and Sam Hendricks had fallen asleep, exhausted and grinning, in the porch rocking chair. It was, Daniel thought, watching Violet finally sit down beside him on the porch steps as the barrel fires burned low and the smoke haze began, at last, to thin with a shift of the night wind, exactly the kind of victory his years on the trail had taught him to value most, one won by cleverness and nerve and the willingness of good people to stand together, rather than one bought with anyone's blood. "You were magnificent," he told her, taking her hand, mindful still of his healing palm. "You built 3 fires and blew a cow horn," she said, though she was smiling, exhausted and radiant in the dying firelight. "I merely read him a newspaper article that has not been printed yet." It worked. It worked because you knew exactly how frightened men behave when they believe they are outnumbered, and because you trusted me enough to let me stand beside you and say my piece instead of hiding me in the root cellar for safekeeping. "I learned that from someone," Daniel said. "A very stubborn schoolteacher who once told me fear is only useful if you let it tell you what to do instead of what to feel." The days that followed unraveled Elias Cobb's careful empire with a speed that surprised even Sarah Talbot, whose newspaper story ran exactly as promised and was picked up by papers as far away as Tucson and Santa Fe. The territorial marshal, presented with sworn statements from Prout, from Pike and his fellow writers, from Dr. Finch, and from 3 miners' wives brave enough at last to speak on the record, rode out within the week to place Elias Cobb under arrest on charges of land fraud, extortion, and endangerment of his own workforce through knowingly unsafe mining conditions. Cobb attempted to flee toward the Colorado River crossing rather than face the charges, but was intercepted at a stage relay station by the marshal's posse, still wearing, absurdly, the same too-fine suit in which he had first ridden into Daniel's yard to offer his bribe. The Ironwood mine passed, under territorial receivership, into new ownership within the year, its most dangerous shafts sealed, its debt-bound workers released from contracts a territorial judge declared void as products of fraud and coercion. Jasper Kell was eventually located in Sacramento, and though he never returned to Arizona territory to answer for his part in the scheme, his written confession, taken by a California notary and sent east at the urging of Sarah Talbot's persistent correspondence, provided the final piece of evidence needed to formally correct the Prescott Land Office records. The Wilcox patent was restored in full to Violet's name, a fact that might, in a less generous story, have meant the end of Daniel Boone's claim to the only home he had built in 15 years of wandering. Instead, standing once more in the Prescott Land Office before a considerably more cooperative Mr. Prout, Violet did exactly what she had told Daniel weeks before, that she believed her father would have wanted. "I am deeding 120 acres of this parcel to Daniel Boone outright," she told the clerk, "in recognition of 3 years of improvements made to the land in good faith, and reserving 40 acres along the creek, including the spring, for the establishment of a public schoolhouse to serve the children of this valley and of the mining camp, to be held in trust and never sold to any private mining interest, now or in the future." "And the house?" Prout asked, glancing between the two of them with the particular curiosity of a man who had watched an entire drama unfold across his counter over the preceding weeks. Violet looked at Daniel, and something warm and certain passed between them. "The house," she said, "I believe falls within the 120 acres, Mr. Prout, and I have every intention of continuing to live in it, provided its owner does not object to the arrangement." "I do not object in the slightest," Daniel said, and the smile he gave her was not the careful, guarded smile of the man who had first faced her down in his yard, but something entirely open, entirely undefended. The schoolhouse rose that autumn on the 40 acres by the creek, built with lumber donated by half the ranch families in the valley, and labor volunteered by miners newly freed from Cobb's debts, men who understood, better than most, exactly what it would mean for their children to grow up able to read every contract, every letter, every book that came within their reach. Violet stood before her first class of 11 children on a crisp October morning, smoke long since cleared from the valley skies, replaced by the ordinary blue of an Arizona autumn, and felt, for the first time since her father's death, that she had finally arrived exactly where she was meant to be. Daniel sat at the back of that first classroom on opening day, ostensibly there to finish a repair on a window latch, though everyone present understood he had simply wanted to watch. When the lesson turned, As Violet had planned it should, to the letters of the alphabet, he found himself mouthing the shapes along with the youngest pupils, no longer ashamed of the movement of his own lips. And when Violet's eyes found his across the room in the middle of her lesson, she did not miss a word of her teaching, but the smile she gave him carried a promise that had nothing to do with reading at all. They were married the following spring, in a small ceremony held on the schoolhouse grounds beside Cottonwood Creek, with Sam Hendricks standing as witness and Sarah Talbot writing up an account for her paper that was, for once, entirely happy news, and with nearly every family in the valley in attendance, including 3 former miners who had once worked in debt bondage under Elias Cobb and now farmed their own small parcels. Freed at last from a fear that had once seemed as permanent as the mountains themselves. Daniel Boone, who had once believed himself a man too old and too set in his ways for anything but the quiet, solitary business of running cattle, found instead that he had gained a home larger than any ranch, and a partner whose courage had matched his own at every turn, from a smoke-filled stage yard to a firelit standoff in his own front pasture. Violet Wilcox, who had crossed 2,000 miles to claim her father's dream, found that dream not diminished by sharing it, but made larger, rooted now not only in a schoolhouse by a creek, but in the steady, devoted presence of a man who had learned in the end that the most important lessons a person could learn were never found only in books, but in the patient, generous love of someone willing to teach them. The creek ran clear that summer and every summer after, past the schoolhouse and past the ranch house both, watering cattle and children alike, exactly as Thomas Wilcox had once dreamed it would. And if the valley still remembered the smoke and fear of that long-ago summer, it remembered even more clearly the fires that had been lit not to destroy, but to call good people together when it mattered most.